Today on Ink and Insights with SumitSharmaSameer, we welcome Leeya Mehta, poet, fiction writer, essayist, and director of the Ellen Hughes International Writers Center at George Mason University. Leeya's work spans continents and genres, weaving together themes of heritage, displacement, and civic imagination. Her poetry collections, including A Story of the World, Before the Fence, and The Towers of Silence, explore memory, migration, and the intimate ties between family and geography. Her essays, such as those in her column, The Company We Keep, reflect on reading, ethics, and the role of imagination in shaping our civic lives. And her forthcoming novel, Extinction, to be published by Simon and Schuster India in 2026, promises to be a powerful meditation on survival, cultural memory, and global crisis. Beyond her writing, Leeya leads the Hughes Center, a hub for international literary exchange. The center has hosted initiatives like Baldwin 100, celebrating James Baldwin's centennial, and continues to champion exiled and marginalized voices while fostering dialogue across borders. Today, we'll explore her creative journey, her vision for literature's role in civic life, and the future of global storytelling. Leeya, welcome to Ink and Insights with SumitSharmaSameer.
Thank you so much, Sumit. I'm very delighted to be here. I'm excited to be in Washington, D.C. and have you in Kathmandu. It's really amazing.
Exactly.
Yeah. Thank you so much for hosting me on your show. I really enjoyed your show.
Thank you, Leeya. Yeah, your poetry. Let's get started with poetry. I think that's where you started your literary journey. Your poetry often explores family and geography. How do these themes intersect in a story of the world before the fence?
So, I come from Bombay, which has its very distinctive geography. I grew up on the south part of the island, which is very narrow, and you can see the ocean on both sides, the bay on one side, the Arabian Sea on the other. And it was interesting that much of the way that Bombay was shaped geographically was through the intervention of man, of human beings, reclaiming land, imagining places where the ocean were to be, land. And so I lived on reclaimed land. And that idea that man has this tremendous impact on the natural environment was fascinating to me at the time, even as I grew up, just wondering about like the tectonic instability of the place. And then simultaneously, you sort of see echoes of that external geography in the family and in life, within the family, and how we create, I guess, redesign in some ways the family life, or are dependent on the history of who we are and our ancestors, and how that history defines our current family life, and how we respond to, not just trauma, but also to humor, to language and other things within the family and within those interpersonal relationships, and sort of seeing a mirror in some ways between, the violence sometimes even in the family, and the joy and all of the other things, to create like this sense of a city or the sense of a community. And I noticed when I was early on in Washington, D.C., where the city doesn't have quite the rhythm that Bombay has. You come to Bombay, Bombay immediately. It's
Right.
like New York.
Right.
You pick up the rhythm.
Right.
And DC didn't have that. And I noticed that it seemed to not know itself at times. And then as I explored it more, I realized that one of the interesting things about it geographically is that it has this forest land that is the national parks that run through it. And so
Right.
it kind of divides the city into two halves, so to speak, the eastern and the western. And with segregation and racial sort of demarcations, keeping people apart. The way that they developed the city was also to make sure that you couldn't travel very easily from east to west. The way that the freeways were built, the rivers, the way that the rivers were used to not channel traffic, from east to west, from black city to white city. That sort of design of a city, especially when you have more or less the ability to create not from scratch, because there's always indigenous people and the way that the land has been used for hundreds of thousands of years by human beings and human civilization. But that sense that you're imposing the caste system in a way of America onto the city. And yet it is, the highest level of human achievement, so to speak, the American Empire, almost like a Roman city, Roman Empire. It's physically looks so much like a Roman city. And so that's sort of like, that was interesting. And it sort of played into thinking then about how do you think of that relationship between nature and it's a difficult relationship between nature and man, right? Man and nature are always a little bit in conflict, not a little bit, a lot in conflict. And so who is keeping who out? Who is negotiating? That negotiation changes all the time. You see it on Mount Everest. I was just thinking about that. You think you can chart your way to the top, and you figured it out, and then the mountain takes over. So there's always that negotiation, especially with climate. And so that was something that I was exploring, but I wanted it to be within the intimacy of the family, and to approach it from the perspective of an imagined ancestor. And that's where my book starts, the story of the world, an imagined ancestor or ancestors coming from Iran to India.
Right. And what role does, as you have rightly pointed out, the linkages between, the migration from Iran to India? I was trying to ask the second question. What role does migration and displacement play in your poems?
I think that history really interests me, but not just for my own, my own people, but noticing how many people are involved in, human beings are constantly migrating from the beginning of time. We're moving and we're negotiating home all the time. What does it mean? And so I think from the particular sort of the mythical sort of story of the Parsis of India is that they came in the 9th and 10th century to India, and they integrated and stayed apart both in ways that both preserved their culture and also absorbed the culture of India. So I think that ability that we have to do those two things, to bring the past and also to assimilate into the present, that you sort of see with the new New York mayor with Zohran Mamdani and with others. It just takes a lifetime, and it even takes a part of a lifetime to make that connection to history, and then to also assimilate. And what is sort of connecting us is these great stories, these myths, these ideas about human freedom in particular, and the freedom to practice not just your religion and your culture, but also your ethics. And there is this sort of poetry to the Parsi imagination that the ethics is sort of the basis of our daily practice. We are the good words, good thoughts, good deeds is sort of the stereotypical idea. What is a Parsi sort of saying to themselves? And so I think over time also, like, the philosophical premise of what is our purpose why are we here? What is our purpose? And that sense that the heritage of the refugee or the migrant or the traveler, depending on what word you use, is to kind of sublimate that intimacy of the family living in a new place, and making new friends and making the society like a great society with your contribution, and stirring things up sometimes and then fitting in at other times. And so there's, again, a negotiation, I think, because you're always sort of an outsider, and yet you feel legitimately like you can participate in the experiment of whatever it is you're doing. And I think in the 20th century, especially during the independence movement in India and then post-independence, at least for my family, there was this immense adoration and sort of a sense of the power of democracy, that we could all be so very different and we may not agree with each other. And so that is partly also the refugee or the migrant's experience. You can be the outsider, but you can still participate in an ethical, civic, and public life and feel legitimately like you belong to it and you can embrace it and participate fully in it.
Right.
So, but that's not really in my poems, but yeah.
Looks like all the time we kind of negotiate with the entire moments that we live throughout our life, Leeya. And do you see poetry as a form of witness or resistant in today's world?
So I definitely see it in other people's work, of course. They say the poetry of witness and provocation, of course. I think that is one of the roles of poetry, whether it's, Musa Babu Toha's poetry, more recently from Palestine, or, yes, absolutely. But at the same time, I think that poetry is a place of emotional sort of rest and restoration, and almost like an altar of sorts for me, a place where you go when you're happy, when you're sad, when you're other people's poetry, when you feel deeply about something. And so poetry is kind of a companion through life, just like a friend is a companion or a partner is a companion. The thing about poetry, though, is that it is a companion throughout life. It sort of spans the beginning to the end of life, And so I was introduced to it by my grandmother, who, her name was Armaidi, and she would recite poems and we would learn them by heart and recite them at the table. And so I didn't always read the poems, I just heard them. And she also wrote her own poems, and they were little rhymes, and they had whimsy, and there's that sense that you can enjoy poetry because it's a thing in itself, it's something to savor and enjoy and laugh about, and it epitomizes the different aspects of life, the different moments and the emotional life. So but very much I think the poetry of witness is as important, and sometimes a poem is both things. It's doing a lot of things at the same time, but in a distal space.
तिमीसँग अब धेरै टाइम छैन है, बिहे गर्नु छ भने गरिहाल, नत्र घरबाट मलाई अन्त्य बिहे गर्दिनु।
भर्खर 3 वर्ष भयो एमबीबीएस जोइन गरेको, 5 वर्षको कोर्स हो। के भो? अचम्म छ। एक्सक्यूज मी सर मेरो 5 वर्षको कोर्स 3 वर्षमा सकाउन मिल्दैन?
गेट आउट।
हेलो,
के सोच्यौ त?
के सोच्ने? मैले प्रिन्सिपलसँग पनि कुरा गरिसके। 3 वर्षमा पनि केही हुन्छ? के हुन्छ 3 वर्षमा?
के भयो भाइ? ल बस साउजी एक कप चिया। कसले भन्यो 3 वर्षमा केही हुँदैन भनेर? यो हेर एलआइसी नेपालको धनवृष्टि योजनामा 3 वर्षमा पैसा फिर्ता हुन्छ।
ए हो र?
जीवन बीमाको साथमा धनवृष्टि 3 वर्षमा एलआइसी नेपालको धनवृष्टि योजना। एलआइसी नेपाल।
Let's talk about your forthcoming novel, Extinction. Your forthcoming novel, Extinction, by Simon & Schuster, India, in 2026. It's coming out. I think it deals with themes of survival and loss. Could you share its central premise?
I think it has many premises, probably, but one of them definitely is that. It's an intergenerational story about a Parsi family, and it focuses on 3 generations in the 20th century, but it also goes back to a couple of one generation before and one generation after. So it's a story about a grandmother, a mother, and a daughter, and it's from the perspective of the daughter. And then there are other generations that come up in the course of it. And it's also a love story between these generations and a love story between another family. So it's a Punjabi family, and these 2 families kind of run parallel to each other and have this inter kind of mixing of sorts. And so it's very much a love story as well. Yeah. And so, I mean, I think that one of the themes in my work that even in the poetry and in my essays that does come up, though the 3 are quite different. I kind of deal with different aspects of things in different places. But one of the things that does come up is this sort of relationship between nature and man, and how in India in particular, there is an evolution, not just between, animals and nature and human beings, but also within men and women and how we relate to one another. And it's, of course, it's everywhere. We're very, very brilliant, clever creatures, right? As human beings.
Right.
We sometimes need to push ourselves to the brink. Sometimes we fall over the cliff, like has happened at different times in history all over the world, exemplified right now in certain parts of the world, but it's been happening a long time, and we do terrible things and we push ourselves and we go over the brink. And so it really is that I think in some ways conceptually I'm taking you to the brink in the book, and then asking philosophically maybe the question, and many questions, and I won't give away the main theme of the book at all here, but is sort of like where is the personal, where is your personal free will? Like, where is free will in all of this? And what do you do to kind of pull yourself back off the brink? Like, how do you do that if you do it? But they say with fiction that you shouldn't have a central premise or something where, you're not going to hit anybody on the head with an idea. So there's many threads running through it. And I hope at the end of the day, it's a love story about how we come to love each other, even though we're so terribly flawed. Each of us is very flawed, but we still find ways to love and laugh and be human together.
Right. We look forward to reading your work, Leeya, pretty soon.
Thank you.
Was there any inspiration behind this work? And how does it connect to contemporary global anxieties?
Yeah, I think there were many things. I mean, the contemporary global anxiety, maybe I can mention first, but, we carry so much with us as we go, whether we're, our pasts are not just determined by the past that we've lived in our lives, but also by the anxieties and the pasts of our immediate family, and then a generation or 2 before that we are conscious of. And so here with these people who are moving, we're always moving around the world in different ways. We're moving cities, we're moving from rural to urban. There's the big, the economic structural changes. We move in class, we move we move out of the caste system maybe, and then inhabit a contemporary system, whatever that class system is. Like someone like, I was thinking of Baba Sahib Ambedkar. And so there is that sense of how do you but at the end of the day, the individual person is experiencing it all, right? Their consciousness is negotiating this very complex outside and inside world, and we live really in our interior world, and so in a way the book is exploring that interior world. How does that interior world consciously live in the reality of the moment and the experiences that they're having, negotiate history, and then also where is fantasy and the life of sort of the imagination. And so I think those are the things that are part of all of us, and also our fears and our worst fears and our monsters and our terrible anxieties, about, of course, in the US, everybody says they love calling things an epidemic, except if it's an actual epidemic. Some people don't want to call it an epidemic, but the age of anxiety, the epidemic of anxiety, the epidemic of loneliness. And I think that the loneliness part is something I'm more interested in that, how do we negotiate our own loneliness in our interior life? And sometimes it's through gaming and being online and feeling like we're reaching out and connecting and, being stimulated in different ways. But how do we take that and in a way, talk about it, in literature, in without again hitting someone on the head about this is how our interior life operates.
Right. And have you also weaved your personal history into this fictional narrative without really making them autobiographical?
Yes and no. I think yes and no. Yeah, I think that the original inspiration for the book came from a very interesting place, which was the essence of my grandmother. So she was very practical and realistic, and she was able to, as I was saying, we have these different planes of our interior life, but she seemed to operate in a very practical way. And yet, somewhere along the way, you'd notice a magic to her. She had an ability to communicate with cats that was really interesting and kind of magical. And if you were superstitious, you'd say, what's going on here? Why can she do this? So there's a funny story about how she she could whisper to them and talk to them in ways that were not quite normal seeming. But she was at a friend's house and there was a terrible storm outside, and there was a cat in the house. It was cold. I imagine it was a place like Shimla or something, but maybe it was somewhere else. But that's the apocryphal story. And she just basically communicated to the cat to go out in the rain, and the cat went out in the rain. And so I think that sort of quality of her poetry, her sense of having this very spanking clean exterior life. But I imagine that within, like with most people, all human beings have an interior life. And so exploring that interior life became part of the puzzle of trying to understand who she was. And that was one of the inspirations, which makes for an interesting story, I think. And I'm, again, not giving away the more important part of what her relationship was with cats, because the cats were big cats. They were not small cats. They were, lions and tigers too. So
Right. So I'll stop there asking any further question about your forthcoming novel, and I'd like to move on to essay part. Your column, I think, the company we keep, explore reading ethics and imagination. How did that experience shape your essayist style?
I think it really shaped me a lot in that I was able to find my essay voice, which is a very kind of, as a writer, I remember Eunice D'Souza, who was my teacher at St. Xavier's in Bombay, saying, you have to find your voice in poetry. And at some point I found that voice. And I think that The Towers of Silence was the first poem where I felt like, yeah, I got it. Like I got my voice. It's there. Which is a poem about how does a family that's migrating and developing scientifically continue to find ways to leave behind like remnants of themselves. Where do you bury your dead? And so at some point quite early on, I think I found my essay voice through that column, and it was inspired initially by meeting James Salter, who was an American fiction writer who was considered to be the best writer of the Americans, like the sentence. He's a beautiful writer. And that was my first edition. And then I went on from there, and then it sort of influenced how I write about James Baldwin as well. And so recently I had an essay come out in an anthology called America's Future in September of 2025. And in that, I also realized that there is the possibility to weave in this sort of very amazing upbringing that I feel like I had in India from the perspective of the reading life and the literary life, and then also my current contemporary life, and how those things can all be in the same essay. And sometimes in fragments, I call it an essay in fragments, but it was inspired to some extent by reading James Baldwin's essay on another lost generation that was based on the modernist writers who were the lost generation. It's Gertrude Stein speaks of Hemingway. It's a bit of a slur of sorts, but it's, and so, but that was picked up from learning about them and reading Hemingway in St. Xavier's at the time that I was developing as a reader, learning how to be a better reader.
Right. And Leeya, do you see essays as a bridge between your poetry and fiction?
I think it's a third place. I don't think it's a bridge. At least I haven't been able to fully see that. It is a third place. Natasha Trethewey, who is the Poet Laureate of the U.S., she has amazing poems, and then she has these great essays. And she sometimes writes the poems into the essays. And I often think, well, would I be able to do that? And I think that I would have to write special poems for the essays to be able to do that. I don't think I could just borrow from, it's not like it's a companion to. So, for example, I had a poem that was published in the Beloit Poetry Journal. That's quite a difficult poem. It's called The Abduction, and it's about the tension between wanting to belong and then not wanting to participate in, history's sort of genocides and so on. And how do you do that as a person? Do you give up who you are to be able to be a pacifist, or to exit from a deep, a historical violence or a contemporary violence? And it came from the nuclear testing that India was doing in the 90s, and this sort of idea that we were this pacifist country, but then we were also a nuclear power, and how do you negotiate the idea of India in that context. And I remember feeling a great sense of loss. And so nobody understood that poem. But when they published it, they loved it, and they asked me to write an essay about it so I could explain it. So that was, those two went together pretty well. And but otherwise, no, they're sort of a separate thing.
Right. Yeah, I think now we are around come to an end of the program. So perhaps this is my last question for today's episode. You are also a director of the LNCU's International Writers Center. So tell us, what is your vision for its role in global literary exchange?
That's a great question. I think that the main thing that I've noticed is that, like with James Baldwin and celebrating the Baldwin 100, is that sometimes, like with Baldwin, you need to leave home, or you need to leave the place that is constraining you for whatever reason, to see it from afar, but it always remains home. And so James Baldwin talks about, in one of his essays, about how if he had stayed as a teenager and a young man in America at the time of segregation, that he would have done violence to himself or somebody else, and that he had to leave to survive and to reflect and to write. And the main thing was to write, to find what you love and to do it, and to find people that you love and to be around them. And so that, I think, kind of sums up the fact that as an International Writers Center, we are so lucky to be able to hear and read these experiences of writers from all over the world, because it sort of makes us feel less lonely. But then through public life and civic life, you start to have intimate relationships with one another in the pursuit of this literary life. And why is the literary life even important? Like, why should a student at George Mason or in Bombay or in Kathmandu care? And I think it comes back to what we were talking about at the beginning, is that we spend so much of our time in our interior, even if we're doing other things, and we're the most intimate with ourselves. And so that is the place where you negotiate your own history, your loneliness, and your connection to other people and your purpose. It is in literature. Literature allows you to do that. And so, and it connects you to other people, but not just in a very profound way, so that your imagination is always free, no matter what the shackles are around you of class or caste or country or whatever your experience is. Your imagination, that interior life, is liberated, and can be liberated. And so I think that's where we sort of connect to one another. We're sort of, I call it sort of Auden's ironic points of light, that it's not about national boundaries, it's about people connecting to one another with our flaws and our difficulties, in a common sense of the human imagination being this connector. And it reveals a lot, like the curiosity that it builds in each other is tremendous. Like movies or music too, right? The arts in general. Yeah.
Right. Leeya, our human imagination can be liberated and should be liberated. On that note, let's wind up today's episode. I'd like to thank you once again for your time. It was lovely talking with you, Leeya.
Thank you.